The timeline was set before you were even born. It was a quiet instruction, passed down without words. You grew up, you went to school, and then you got married. In 1950 or 1955, the path was clear. There were no gap years. There was no time spent waiting for a revelation. The self was not something you found. It was something you built, and you built it by joining your life to someone else's. For a young man, marriage was the signal that boyhood was over. It meant you were steady. It meant you could be trusted. For a young woman, it was the essential threshold. It was the start of the life you had been trained for. The pressure wasn't loud. It didn't feel like a demand. It felt like gravity. Everyone around you was doing it. Your friends were getting pinned. Then they were getting engaged. Then the invitations arrived. To stand still was to be left behind. So you looked for a partner. You looked for someone who made sense. Did you ask yourself if this was the person who understood your deepest thoughts? Probably not. That wasn't the question. The question was simpler. Is he a good man? Is she a nice girl? Do we want the same kind of house? Do we attend the same church? If the answers were yes, you proceeded. There was a sense of urgency. Waiting felt dangerous. It felt like tempting fate. So you set the date. You stood at the altar. You made the promises. You weren't unhappy. You were relieved. You had done what you were supposed to do. You had secured your place in the world. The door to adulthood was open, and you had walked through it. To be alone was to be suspect. In that era, a single man in his 30s was a question mark. People wondered why he hadn't settled down. Was he irresponsible? Was he immature? A single woman faced a quieter, sharper judgment. Marriage was the only true proof of maturity. It was the membership card for society. If you wanted to be treated as a full adult, you needed a spouse. You needed that ring on your finger to show that you had been chosen and that you had chosen in return. Love was part of the conversation, certainly. Everyone wanted to fall in love. But the definition of love was different then. It was less about a thunderbolt of emotion and more about a steady arrangement. You were told that love was something that grew. It wasn't necessarily there in full bloom at the start. You planted the seed of commitment, and you watered it with duty, and you expected affection to follow. Compatibility was not the primary language. You did not look for a mirror of your own soul. You looked for character. A man looked for a woman who would keep a good home, who would be a gentle mother. A woman looked for a provider, someone who was sober, hardworking, and kind. If you found those things, you considered yourself lucky. To ask for more felt greedy. It felt like asking for a fairy tale in a world concerned with concrete realities. You married for potential. You married because it was time to build a life, and you couldn't build it alone. The honeymoon ended, and the routine began. This was the structure of the days. The alarm clock rang. Coffee was brewed. The car backed out of the driveway. The house went quiet, then busy with the work of maintenance. Two people learned to function in the same space. It was a negotiation of habits. He had his chair. She had her kitchen. He had the yard work on Saturdays. She had the grocery shopping on Thursdays. These weren't just chores. They were territories. They were the ways you defined who you were within the marriage. You didn't analyze the relationship. You lived it. If there was silence at the dinner table, it wasn't necessarily heavy. It was just the end of a long day. The radio was on, or later, the television. You watched the same shows. You laughed at the same jokes. You sat on the same sofa. That proximity was the bond. There was a comfort in the predictability. You knew what to expect. You knew that at 5:30 the door would open. You knew that on Sunday there would be a roast. You knew that bills would be paid and shirts would be ironed. There was a safety in this. The world outside could be chaotic, but inside the house there were rules. Conflicts happened, of course, but they were often kept low. Voices were rarely raised. To yell was to lose dignity. Disagreements were often swallowed or stepped around. You didn't sit down to discuss your feelings. You went for a drive. You cleaned the oven. You went to the workshop in the garage and fixed something that was broken. You worked it out through your hands, not your words. Function was the highest form of success. If the children were clean and fed, if the lawn was mowed, if the car was running, then the marriage was working. But there were spaces between the routines. There were evenings when the television was off, and the house was still, and the distance between the two armchairs felt wide. Affection was often restrained. It was private. Even in private, there was a reserve. You didn't burden your spouse with your internal worries. You didn't dump your fears on the table. You carried them yourself. That was what being strong meant. A husband might feel a crushing weight of responsibility, a fear that he couldn't keep providing, but he would not say it. He would just work longer hours. He would just go quiet. A wife might feel a profound loneliness, a sense that her world had shrunk to the size of 4 walls, but she would not complain. Who would she complain to? Her mother had lived this way. Her neighbors lived this way. So, desires went unspoken. Maybe you wanted to travel. Maybe you wanted to study. But you pushed those thoughts down. You smoothed them over like wrinkles in a bedsheet. The phrase, "That's just how it is," settled many arguments before they started. This wasn't misery. It wasn't a tragedy. It was simply a lower volume of living. There was love, but it was a quiet, dutiful love. It was expressed in the folding of laundry. It was expressed in the checking of the oil in the car. It was a love of service, not of passion. The deeper connection, the kind where you are completely known, that was rare. You didn't expect your spouse to be your best friend. They were your partner. Those were different things. You lived parallel lives that intersected at mealtimes. Decades pass. The albums are opened. You look back at the photos, the black and white wedding portraits, the stiff poses, the hopeful, young faces. You realize that you did it right. According to the rule book you were given, the game was won. You stayed together. You honored your vows. You provided. You endured. There is no regret in this. There is only a quiet awareness. You see that the safety you built required a certain kind of silence. It required that parts of yourself were never introduced to your spouse. It worked. The system worked. It created stable neighborhoods and predictable lives. But words remained unsaid. Questions remained unasked. It is easy to look back and see the limitations, but we must also see what was there. There was resilience. There was a capacity to stick with something, even when it was dull, even when it was hard. They married because it was the right thing, and for them, at that time it was. They gave what they knew how to give. They loved in the only language they were taught to speak. That was the way love was understood.